Total war, patterned by the Nazis for all Europe, comes at last to Germany.
This is a World War II German jackboot, one of the most infamous and one of the most feared boots in the entire world, if you can be afraid of a boot, that is. And then maybe it's more of just the people that were wearing the boots were a lot of people feared, and maybe the association with the German jackboot. And we're gonna cut it in half to see how this almost 80-year-old boot was built back in World War II times. And there's probably a few things, I'll say, I'm gonna take a guess at 10 things you didn't know about the German jackboot. Today's video is sponsored by War Thunder. War Thunder is a free-to-play military vehicle combat game. It has great graphics, authentic sound effects, and beautiful music, creating an atmosphere to fully immerse yourself in. And immersive vehicle damage model in gaming, no general hit points, but vehicles suffer actual damage to their components and crew instead. I like using the Tiger tank because I'm a bit of a history buff, and so when it comes to choosing a tank from the World War II era, you gotta choose a Tiger tank. It's the biggest, it's the baddest, it's the most intimidating. It's available on Xbox Series X and S, PC, PlayStation 5, and previous generations of consoles, and it's totally cross-platform. So players on PC can play it with PlayStation, PlayStation can play Xbox, so on, and all the different platforms can play on the same servers, which is really nice. So register using my link below and play for free, and seriously, it's a free game. It's not like it's a trial to play a free game, it's a truly free game. And you can also get a free premium tank, an aircraft, and a ship, and a 7-day account boost when you register. So that's just another boost on top of all of it. So thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and be sure to register using my link below so we get credit for you downloading the free game. We've cut apart a handful of vintage military boots at this point, and none of them made people as upset as the first World War II boot we cut apart, the American World War II boot. And that's 100% understandable. I get where you're coming from, destroying history, but I think there's some good reasons why we do this video. So I'm gonna give you my pitch on maybe 5 reasons why you should be at least okay with me cutting apart these beautiful pieces of history, aside from the fact that we make money by doing these videos. Number 1, they're not as rare as you think. You can buy tons of these boots online for under 300 bucks, easy to find. Number 2, I consider this a preservation of history to some degree. We're taking a physical product, digitalizing it, and really showing you what this boot really is. Number 3, we're showing you something about a piece of history that you've never seen before. For instance, if you loved tanks from World War II, but you never knew it was on the inside, you didn't know which engine, you don't know how thick the steel plate was, that's important information. Obviously, it's a little bit more important than how boots are built, but still an important piece of history, especially to boot nerds. Number 4, the total amount of views we've had on all the historical war boots is about 4 million views in the last 2 years. And to put that in perspective, the National World War II Museum has around 700,000 visitors a year. So to me, it's worth it to educate and inform 4 million people on the finer details of a very specific part of our history, of the world's history. And number 5, we're not destroying the boots fully. We don't just throw them in like a wood chipper after. We still have them to reference in future videos. And at some point, it'd be really cool to make a big display with the boot cut in half next to the full boot with a bunch of arrows pointing to all the different parts of the boot that we could even put in a museum and donate to museums in the future to give more context to the boots that were worn in World War II. And if you still hate the fact that we're destroying a historical artifact, I totally understand it, but at least you know where I'm coming from now. So what is a jackboot? Well, the term jackboot is not the original name of the boot. People theorize that it came from the French word jacques, meaning coat of mail, because the original tall reinforced boots that cavalry troops wore, they had them reinforced with steel and a bunch of other harder materials to prevent swords from cutting through to their shins. But the German military referred to these boots as the Marschstiefel. Did my best. AKA marching boot. And lots of people will call lots of different pull-on boots jackboots, but most of the time the true form, the true use of the word jackboot is referring to this style of boot. So what is the history of the jackboot? Well, when you picture a German soldier from World War II, there's a good chance that you're picturing them in this boot with their pants tucked in. But the jackboot predates World War II, and it even predates World War I. So we'll do a quick, short and condensed history of the jackboot in like 60 seconds so that you can have a bigger picture of where this boot came from. And also keep in mind, it's super difficult to do research on this type of thing because it's such an old boot, and documentation from this time period is really hard to find and really hard to trust for obvious reasons. And so we did a lot of research, but a lot of the research isn't backed by a whole lot. So take it all with some bit of grain of salt, multiple grains of salt. But the first standardized military version of this boot was issued in 1866, and obviously all throughout history there's been tons of pull-on boots, but this version of it with the protective layer and the lineage that led to this boot, this first standardized one was in 1866. And the German armies and Prussian armies used different varieties and versions of this boot up until about 1910, and then an even more standardized version was issued in World War I, where mass production and assembly lines and access to higher quantity materials and a higher need for more standardized boots because of World War I, they even further standardized this boot. And then leading up to World War II, production really ramped up, and then in 1939, the standard height that was required was dropped from 35 to 39 centimeters tall down to 32 to 35 to save on leather, because this boot takes a lot of leather, and we'll talk more about that. But interestingly, they stopped issuing the non-combat facing groups this boot in 1940. And I just assumed that these were worn all throughout World War II because of the media that we see. And then in 1943, they completely stopped issuing this boot. And then obviously after World War II, things changed, but the German military still issued and wore various styles of the jackboot up until the 1970s. And a little bit of pretty morbid history. Concentration camps used prisoners for slave labor to make and test the boots, specifically Continental rubber soles. Continental ordered 1,000+ kilometer walks on ice and snow to test the rubber soles, and prisoners were executed if they weakened and failed. So aside from the already dark history of this boot, it gets even darker, and it's interesting to see some of these companies that are still around, how they deal with some of the issues from their past. But why did the German army like the jackboots over the more commonly seen lace boots? Well, they're more water resistant because there's no laces, there's no tongue, and because they're taller, so there's just not as much area for water to leak in. The height of the boot also prevented more of the rocks and dust and debris getting into the inside of your boot, and they were faster and easier to put on and take off at any time. And one thing about not having laces that people maybe underestimate about this boot is you don't really understand how dependent you are on your boots, and more specifically your laces, until one breaks. You know, I did some firefighting in my early 20s, and there's literally nothing worse than being way up on a mountain, depending on your boots, and then your laces break, and now all of a sudden you're completely useless as a firefighter. And so you're trying to tie knots in them, and you're trying to get them to work, and you're borrowing parts from different people, and you're just trying to solve this problem of the weakest part on your boot, which is the laces. And something interesting is a lot of people assume that Hugo Boss designed all of the uniforms for the German military, but in fact all he did was produce the uniforms for the SS, SA, and the youth. And a lot of people also assume that all these boots were made in one specific factory with one pattern and they're all identical. But if you think about it, in the 40s and the late 30s, they didn't have the same scale of mass production that we have now, and they didn't have the need to keep them super specific and uniform across the board. They were just trying to make boots to put on soldiers' feet. And so there's a huge variety of different configurations and slightly different changes, and even some of the officers would have custom versions of these made because they could and they were more comfortable. And now to the part that I find super interesting is how was this boot built, and what are the materials and what are the quality of the materials. So starting with the leather first, just the shaft alone, if we take a measurement of that, that's 5 millimeters thick of leather, and I'm not sure what exactly reinforces it. And we wanted to get a general measurement of the thickness of the leather throughout the entire boot, so we cut a quick little spot in here to get the caliper in. And the leather thicknesses vary from about 1.5 to 2 millimeters thick, so surprisingly thin, especially compared to more modern standards of leather boots. You know, that's 1.5 is more what you see in a sneaker. And you can see from the cross section that they actually do use a higher quality leather. It's a full grain leather. You can see that grain pattern at the top there. And some people say online that the vamp was the rough out, the flesh out leather, and that smooth grain was flipped to the inside for more durability. It just looks smooth because of how they've polished it over the years. It's really surprising how much leather actually goes into this boot. Just this upper piece alone is a solid piece of leather that wraps all the way around. And like that alone's got to be like 4 square feet of leather. And so it makes sense why they started to cut down on the height of these boots for the standard issue ones. And back then, Germany wasn't known for their leather production. They have some really high-end tanneries now, or I guess one high-end tannery, but back then they weren't really known for it. And they had to import the majority of the leather they used in World War I and World War II. And they were a really leather heavy kit with the bags and the different holders and the different boots being super high. And so I think that's part of why halfway through World War II, they quit making this tall a boot and started moving towards more of the laced boots, because it probably takes twice as much leather to make this boot. And something that we read during the research for this video is that in World War II, a lot of these boots were not shipped black. They were just shipped to or given to the soldiers in the natural leather color. It was kind of tan. And the soldier was responsible for blacking the boots and making them black to the uniform standard. And so they do that with a shoe polish, basically, to dye the leather and make it completely black, which had some interesting benefits to it, because with most of the shoe polish, it's a really heavy wax based polish, and so that naturally adds some water protection. And we did a little water protection or a little water resistance test behind me, so you can see that even now 80 years later, it still beads up water pretty well because of that heavy layer of polish on top. And all that polish also helped with keeping the threads from letting water leach in. And just out of curiosity, we wanted to see how waterproof these boots were 80 years later. And obviously there's some splits in the leather here and there, but we just wanted to see. So we threw it in the water tank, and as you can see, it did stay fairly waterproof. Obviously, it let some water in over some time, but it was really surprising how little water the actual leather absorbed. And just like the upper leather, the leather outsoles can absorb water and can be really slippery in any form of wet conditions. If you've ever had a pair of leather shoes or boots, you know exactly what I mean. You just hydroplane out of control. And another problem with leather, especially as an outsole, it wears out really fast, especially compared to the rubber compounds of the modern era. But they had a solution for the fast wearing outsole, and that was basically just putting big metal studs on the bottom of the outsole that are called hobnails. And a lot of people assume that hobnails were attached to the bottom to make the boots grip better, but everything that we saw said that they don't even necessarily grip better, because if you think about it, just having metal studs on like cobbled streets and even wet conditions, you're gonna be slipping around just as much, if not more, than having a leather outsole. So if they weren't for traction, then what were the metal stud hobnails in the bottom for? They were allegedly made to make the boot last longer when marching, because of how much marching happened in World War II. And just walking around a little bit in those boots, they definitely are quite slippery. So even though they might have helped with traction, I don't think ultimately that was what they were for. But if you look really closely at this outsole, you can see there's a bunch of pegs going onto the inside of the boot. And this was a fairly common practice for this era, because you know, even back then they would still use steel and metal nails to nail these boots together. But during war times, they got to ration and save as much metal for more important things for war, and boots were not one of them, especially when you can use wooden pegs to hold a boot together and hold an outsole on. And there are some benefits to wooden pegs that you don't get from metal nails, because wooden pegs wear down at about the same rate that leather does, and wood swells about the same rate that leather does, which is important, because if you have metal nails that are wearing down slower than the outsole, you're gonna have little spikes hanging out the bottom of your boot, and it's not gonna wear evenly, and as it gets wet and compresses and expands, it could separate a lot easier than these pegs that compress and expand with the leather, so that it never loses its grip on the actual leather itself. There's still tons of boots that utilize wooden pegs throughout the construction, especially cowboy boots, because we got a cowboy boot series coming up, and they almost all have wooden pegs in them. And then as for the construction of this boot, how is the outsole and the midsole all affixed to the upper of the boot? We don't really know, because there's clearly pegs going to the inside, but I don't see stitching on the outsole or on the welt. So I don't know if it's just hidden because of age and use, or if this was resold at some point, or if they just didn't have stitching on this boot. So we're gonna try to answer that question and really see what's inside of this boot and what the German soldiers were wearing on a daily basis by cutting it in half, destroying a piece of history, but it's worth it for the information, in my opinion. So let's cut them in half. Okay, we got them cut in half, and this was by far the stinkiest boot I've ever cut apart. It must have been sweated in a lot because it was stinky. But let's see what's inside. So we got a big problem with this boot. As soon as we cut it open, we realized that there's a rubber layer in this boot. And we also realized that there's no stitching holding that welt to the outsole, and there's no stitching at all in this boot. It's all just pegged together. Which I would assume during war times they would be saving rubber at all costs for tires and tracks and things that actually need rubber, and not putting it into boots. And I'd also assume that for a war boot, you would want a solid construction with stitching and not just wooden pegs holding your boot together. Even though they do a good job, you probably want stitching in there. And there would be no reason to have a fake welt on a boot that's made for soldiers for war. So I'm kind of wondering if this is just a reproduction of a World War II boot. And if it is, I think it's still a fairly old and authentic looking World War II boot, because some of the things are really interesting on the inside here. Like the toe stiffener is just a piece of burlap, and the reinforcement that gives this upper all its strength is also burlap with just a really heavy layer of leather on the inside. But then you got some other weird inconsistencies where this little strap where the pull tabs were once affixed is a very modern looking strap, you know, with the multiple colors and everything in there. So I think we accidentally bought a very real looking reproduction. But I don't think that invalidates the info that we've gone over in this video, especially with the wooden pegs. It's really cool to see where these wooden pegs go through the boot and how strongly they're still attached to the boot. But the inside of the boot, I don't feel as confident in judging this and saying what type of boot this is, because you've got rubber on the inside. And this is like, it's got a pattern on the top. And that's the whole problem with doing this type of series though, is there's so little information out there, and there's so many reproductions throughout, not just the last 5 years, but basically after World War II, people start doing reproductions. And so it's really hard to know what's real, and it's really hard to know what is closest to the majority of boots that were worn during World War II. And I think what we'll do is we'll buy another boot like this. We'll try to find one with some studs and a few other features that we can show. And then maybe that video will compare the American World War II boot compared to the German World War II boot and see which army had the superior boot. So thank you guys so much for everything you do. And thanks for supporting these historical boot videos, because it's really interesting to see the modern boots that we wear today, where they came from, because a lot of the innovation and growth in the footwear market happened during this time. You know, like these traditional boots, heritage boots that everyone's in love with, they came from this era. So I love these videos. I think they're really fun, and I love digging into the history and finding things out about a part of history that's been around for 80 years that nobody's seen and nobody's known. And I love that aspect of it. So thank you guys so much for everything you do. See ya. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to download it for your Xbox, PlayStation, or PC, and use the code to get the premium tank, the aircraft, the ship, and the 7-day account boost. And thanks to you guys for supporting the sponsors that pay for these videos, that allow us to buy the different boots and shoes to cut them in half, because that's how we afford to do it. So thank you guys, and thanks for all your support. It really means a lot to me. See ya.